What we are doing now to our forests, I think, is probably unexpected and incomprehensible to the average American. That we could have a designation, national forest, and the main activity of the U.S. Forest Service is to cut it down.
It started as a part of a conservation movement, strangely enough, in the sense that the American people had watched the forest products industry leapfrog from New England and the Middle Atlantic states to the south, to the Great Lakes region, and then leapfrog across the Great Plains to the Pacific Northwest. And with each step, what the industry tended to do was to harvest everything, just clear-cut entire landscapes. It was that experience at the beginning of the 20th century, that historical experience with the industry, that led significant parts of the American public to say, we shouldn't let this happen in the West. How U.S. Forest Service went from its conservation mission to being a timber beast, an out-of-control rogue timber beast, is an interesting question all in itself, but that is what happened.
Before World War II, the Forest Service was very much a custodian agency. They pretty much, they cut very little, and they were very much sort of just taking care of the forest as it was. After World War II, the housing boom hit, and timber industry had gone through much of their easy lands, and they started pressuring the Forest Service to cut more federal timber. My experience with the timber program is they would get the cut out at all costs, and they would break laws, and they would break people in order to make sure that they got the cut out.
That's the philosophy of the Forest Service, is when they, the nice thing about trees is what you can do with them once you cut them down. The Forest Service is an agency that's simply addicted to timber. They are devaluing and not putting proper amount of emphasis on other very important public resources.
We've emphasized commercial logging to the detriment of recreation, but also to the detriment of people being able to pursue their spiritual growth in the forest. The value of a 1,000-year-old tree is much greater standing than it is in board feet.
People, I think, have a different view of what our national forests are now about. People come right here every year just to see these woods. The National Forest is where they can connect with a whole group of plants and animal communities that they never get to see.
The national forest lands of the United States are a stronghold for native plants and animals. There's over 10,000 plant species that rely on habitat in the national forest lands and over 3,000 fish and wildlife species. And if we can't curb our rampant and destructive use of those forest lands on our national forests, on lands that belong to the public, then we don't have a chance.
We had summer steelhead, we had Chinook salmon, bull trout, Westlow cutthroat, and they're all in trouble now. And so, I've had a lot of experience watching the timber program, trying to make it compatible with maintaining high quality aquatic resources, and which it just didn't work.
Road building is probably the most damaging thing that happens in logging. It breaks up wildlife habitat. It causes huge amounts of erosion. It funnels water into small sort of drainages which totally wash out down to bedrock. I mean, it just goes on and on, the list of damage. amount of damage that road building in steep country causes.
Simply eliminating road building, I'm not sure would solve our problems. The Forest Service could do incredible amounts of additional damage from the road system it has in place. It has a huge road system already in place.
We have 155 national forests in our national forest system. A little over half of that have already been subjected to some kind of resource extraction, but we still do have approximately 30% of those lands are in a pristine natural state that could still be protected.
The remaining high-quality watersheds and fish and wildlife habitats, the highest quality water quality, will be found on the public lands, the ones that haven't been subjected to extensive timber harvesting and road construction, the roadless areas.
As pressure and development occurs more and more on private lands and state lands, the national forests and the federal lands are going to be the last refuge for a lot of endangered species, and a lot of species that aren't now endangered but will become endangered.
Forests are a national treasure. They don't belong simply to the people who live next to the forest. They belong to the United States of America and to the entirety of the American citizenry. Only about 4% of lumber comes from national forests, but it costs the taxpayer over $1 billion a year to pay someone to deforest our forests. And in the end, the United States government is the only landlord in the world that pays someone to devastate the resources of the landlord.
The current path that we're on is a money loser, not a money maker. And so this amounts to nothing more than corporate welfare. At the end of the day, it's corporate welfare. And at whose expense? Our expense, our environment's expense, our water, clean water, our air, and our children's expense.
The value as watershed, the value for wildlife, for recreation, establish the most important links between those forested landscapes and our local economies as well as the national economies. Those values by far outstrip by 10 to 20 to 1 the timber values associated with those lands.
Only about 3% of all jobs on national forests belong to loggers. About 97% of all jobs associated with national forests relate to tourism, relate to hunting, fishing, activities that are not of a logging nature and sometimes compete with logging.
The argument that industry is fighting for jobs is absurd. They've been moving mills to Mexico, they've been busting unions. They don't like labor. They need labor, but they don't like them. They certainly don't care about jobs. What they care about is, getting their profits, cutting down the trees. And if they could do that without people, they would be the first people to cut the jobs. Over the next 20 years, the next generation of foresters and people working in the Forest Service will probably be A lot of their work will be restoration and repairing damage that's been done in the last 20 years.
I think one could argue that the Forest Service is not capable of managing forests primarily for broad range of non-commercial forest values, natural values. So I think there's, just as there was a very strong case to be made for Congress to intervene in the early 60s to pass a Wilderness Act rather than trusting the Forest Service to protect wildlands, it may well be necessary to just say timber harvest, commercial timber harvest, is not an appropriate use of these lands.
90 years ago, Teddy Roosevelt once said that the only problem with the movement to change our forest policy was that it wasn't enough. And that is even more the case today. And I think if we just begin afresh, if we look at the forest as a national resource, if we look at the forest as part of an international ecosystem, it is very hard to argue that we should be as callous with it as we currently are.
It's time to checkout time for them. They can't do it right. They shouldn't be doing it. You know, we're subsidizing the degradation of the national forest system.
The best and highest use of the public lands of our national forests is to protect the fragile forest ecosystems that we have, that remain, and then start doing restoration. Put people to work actually ripping out roads and protecting our public lands rather than destroying them.
Well, to continue the path we're on is just irresponsible. We really are of this earth, and that we need to go back to maybe find our soul in these areas.
At least we can take the national forest system and let Mother Nature manage it, because I think she does a better job.
We should long ago have said national forests are they're not worth cutting for timber. I think it's time to take the discretion away from the agency, especially on national forests. And the way to do that is just to say there's no commercial logging on national forests, period.